The aroma of freshly ground coffee, a rich, dark promise of the day, usually hung thick and comforting in the air of the daily grind. It mingled with the lighter, sweeter scent of pastries and the barely perceptible tang of cleaning solution, creating a unique olfactory signature that was as familiar to its regulars as the smiling face of Brenda, the head barista. This particular Tuesday morning, however, that comforting tapestry of everyday life was about to be rent, violently, by a single, brutal act. A sharp, cracking sound, like a thunderclap in a library, would momentarily silence the gentle hum of conversation, the clatter of ceramic on saucers, the hiss of the espresso machine, and leave in its wake a stunned, almost disbelieving quiet, punctuated only by the rapid, shallow gasps of onlookers. But it wasn't just the sheer, shocking audacity of the open-handed strike that would sear itself into the collective memory of every patron present. It was the chilling, almost imperceptible transformation of the man who received it. A man whose quiet, unassuming demeanor, whose gentle, almost weary eyes, and whose seemingly ordinary life as a devoted single father masked a past forged in the crucible of unimaginable conflict, a past etched in the very marrow of his bones, a past that the aggressor, a mountain of entitled arrogance, was terrifyingly, spectacularly unaware of. He had just struck a man who, until that precise moment, had merely been a phantom, a whisper of a legend, living out his days in deliberate obscurity. A man who could, in a breath, dismantle a threat with surgical precision, honed over countless moments where life and death hung on a fraction of a second. Mark Jensen settled into his usual booth by the window, the morning sun streaming in, warming his back and illuminating the golden brown highlights in his daughter Lily's hair. She was a whirlwind of 6-year-old energy, currently engrossed in coloring a fantastical unicorn, her tongue peeking out in concentration. Her small backpack, adorned with glittery patches, sat beside her, a miniature world of crayons and half-eaten fruit snacks. Mark watched her, a soft, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, the kind of smile that rarely reached his eyes, which held a perpetual, distant vigilance. He was a man of modest build, though his shoulders were broader than average, and a certain tautness in his posture hinted at an underlying strength. His dark hair was neatly cut, beginning to recede slightly at the temples, and a faint stubble clung to his jawline, suggesting he'd either woken early or hadn't quite had the time for a full shave before wrangling a 6-year-old out the door. His clothes were practical, unassuming, a faded denim shirt, dark jeans, and worn but clean boots. He looked like any other tired but dedicated dad navigating the morning rush, blending seamlessly into the fabric of suburban life, a stark contrast to the life he had once led, now buried deep beneath layers of conscious effort and routine. Their morning ritual at the daily grind was a sacred, almost therapeutic anchor in their week. Tuesdays and Thursdays, after dropping Lily off at elementary school, Mark would stop here, sometimes with Lily for a quick treat before school, or, like today, for a quiet breakfast beforehand. It was their small pocket of peace before the demands of the day descended. Lily would get her chocolate milk and a pastry, and Mark would nurse his black coffee, watching the world go by, finding solace in the mundane ballet of people rushing to work, students poring over textbooks, and the quiet murmur of friendly chatter. He found a peculiar comfort in its predictability, a stark contrast to the unpredictable chaos that had once defined his very existence. He guarded this peace fiercely, like a dragon guarding its last treasure. The cafe itself was a microcosm of the town. Families, students, remote workers, retirees, the gentle clinking of cups, the rhythmic whir of the milk steamer, the hushed conversations. It all formed a soothing symphony that Mark had come to cherish. For years, as he had lived in a world where silence was often a precursor to violence, or the heavy weight of sorrow. Here, silence was merely an absence of sound, a temporary pause. He found himself almost physically relaxing into the background noise, letting it wash over him, helping to obscure the ghosts that still sometimes lingered at the edges of his periphery vision. Suddenly, the ambient peace was shattered, not by anything dramatic, but by a sudden jarring shift in the cafe's energy. The front door swung open with unnecessary force, thudding against the wall, and in strode a man whose very presence seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. Derek Thorne, a local real estate developer, known more for his aggressive tactics and ostentatious displays of wealth than for any genuine success, entered flanked by two equally large and thuggish-looking individuals who acted as a human wall around him. Derek was a hulking figure, his expensive suit stretched taut over a frame that was more brute force than fitness. His face was a perpetually sneering mask, his small, piggy eyes scanning the room not for a friendly face, but for an opportunity to assert dominance. He carried an air of entitlement so thick it was almost visible, like a personal storm cloud following him. He was loud immediately. His voice, a booming, guttural sound, cut through the cafe's hum as he barked an order for 3 lattes at the counter, not bothering to lower his voice or even acknowledge the line of people patiently waiting. Brenda, the barista, visibly flinched, her practiced smile faltering for a split second before she professionally plastered it back on. Lily, then startled by the sudden loudness, looked up from her unicorn, her wide, innocent eyes drawn to the source of the disruption. Mark's posture, which had been subtly relaxed, stiffened by degrees. His hand, resting casually on the table near Lily's, subtly shifted, his fingers splaying slightly. The almost imperceptible shift would have been missed by anyone who didn't know him or who wasn't looking for it. But it was there, a subtle recalibration, like a predator detecting a distant tremor. Derek and his companions commandeered a cluster of tables, dragging them together with a scraping noise that grated on everyone's nerves. He then proceeded to make a series of loud, vulgar phone calls, his voice echoing through the cafe, discussing a dubious land deal in excruciating detail, and peppered with expletives and dismissive comments about potential obstacles, human or otherwise. The cafe's atmosphere became charged, not with tension, but with a collective discomfort, an unspoken resentment. People lowered their voices further or simply looked away, trying to shrink into themselves, to make themselves invisible to the storm that had just walked in. Mark, however, did not look away. Not exactly. He continued to gaze out the window, but his peripheral vision, a finely honed instrument, registered every movement, every shift in the bully's posture, every dismissive wave of his hand. Lily, sensing her father's subtle change, instinctively edged closer to him, her small hand finding his, her coloring forgotten. What was it about this man, Mark wondered, that seemed to scream for confrontation? Now, was it merely the entitlement, the sheer lack of awareness? Or was there something deeper, something more primal, that made certain individuals believe the world was their personal playground, and everyone else merely an extra in their self-aggrandizing drama? Mark had seen such men before, in far more dangerous contexts. Their arrogance in those situations was often their undoing. But here, in the benign safety of a suburban coffee shop, it was merely an annoyance, an irritation that he knew he would have to endure for Lily's sake. He had promised himself a quiet life, a life free from the kind of violence that had defined his past. He wouldn't break that promise, not for a loudmouth in a bad suit. He had buried his old self deep, buried him under years of therapy, self-reflection, and the unwavering love for his daughter. The situation escalated subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Derek, finished with his calls, turned his attention to the cafe itself, his gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight. He made a snide comment about the slow service to one of his companions, loud enough for Brenda to hear, causing her to visibly stiffen behind the counter. Then his eyes, small and hard, landed on Mark and Lily. Perhaps it was the quiet domesticity of their scene, the quiet intensity of Mark's gaze, or simply the fact that Mark wasn't looking away, that drew the bully's attention. He seemed to relish in finding someone who hadn't completely folded under his oppressive presence. "Look at this," Derek sneered, his voice still too loud. "Mr. Dad of the Year over here, staring into space like he's solving world peace. Probably wondering how he's going to afford that kid's college fund with a job like that." His companions chuckled, a low, guttural sound that grated. Mark felt Lily's hand tighten in his. He squeezed back reassuringly, still not looking at Derek directly, focusing instead on the faint condensation forming on his coffee cup. He had learned through years of discipline to control every outward manifestation of his internal state. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. He wouldn't let him ruin Lily's morning, not yet. Lily, however, was not as practiced in the art of emotional suppression. Her small head turned, her brow furrowed in confusion and fear. "Daddy, why is that man being mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of Derek's laughter. Mark gently stroked her hair, a silent promise of protection. "Some people just don't know how to be polite, sweetie," he murmured, his voice calm, steady. "We just ignore them." But ignoring him was proving increasingly difficult. Derek, emboldened by Mark's lack of reaction, saw it as weakness, an invitation. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly, and rose, lumbering towards their booth. His two companions, sensing the impending entertainment, exchanged knowing glances and leaned forward, anticipating the show. As Derek approached, his shadow fell over their table, momentarily obscuring the warm sunlight. He loomed over them, a towering, menacing figure. The smell of his overly expensive cologne, mixed with a faint hint of stale liquor, invaded their space. He planted his beefy hands on the edge of their table, just inches from Lily's unicorn drawing. "What's wrong, pal?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too busy staring out the window, dreaming of a life you'll never have?" He chuckled again, a harsh, mirthless sound. Mark slowly, deliberately picked up his coffee cup, taking a slow sip. His gaze finally shifted not to Derek's face, but to a spot just over his shoulder, a silent message of disinterest. This only seemed to fuel Derek's aggression. "Oh, a strong, silent type, huh?" Derek spat, leaning closer, his face contorted into an ugly sneer. "Let me guess, you think you're too good for the likes of me? Too important to acknowledge a little friendly conversation?" He paused, waiting for a reaction, but Mark offered none, merely continuing to sip his coffee. Lily, however, was now trembling slightly, her small hand gripping Mark's shirt. Mark felt the tremor, and a cold, hard knot began to form in the pit of his stomach. His gaze, still carefully neutral, flickered to Lily's terrified face for a fraction of a second. This was crossing a line. This was no longer about him. It was then, as Derek leaned in, spewing venom, his face inches from Mark's, that a flicker barely perceptible to anyone else crossed Mark's usually placid eyes. A shadow, fleeting and cold. A memory of a different kind of battlefield, momentarily resurfaced in the soft light of a suburban coffee shop. It was the look of a man who had been pushed past a point of no return many times before. A man who knew precisely how to shut down a threat. The casual observer might have seen only a moment of quiet intensity, but to a trained eye it was the brief, for raw exposure of the predator beneath the unassuming exterior. It was the moment the old Mark, the one he had tried so hard to bury, stirred. And then it happened. Derek, frustrated by Mark's unwavering composure, by his infuriating refusal to engage, or to be intimidated, snapped. With a sudden explosive motion, he swung his open hand, a heavy, meaty slap that connected squarely with Mark's left cheek. The sound echoed through the stunned silence of the cafe, a sickening crack that made several patrons jump. Mark's head snapped to the side, his coffee cup clattering softly against the table, a single drop of the dark liquid splashing onto Lily's unicorn drawing. A faint red mark immediately began to bloom on his cheek, stark against his pale skin. The cafe fell into an absolute deathly hush. Every single person present froze, and their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Derek, his face flushed with triumph and adrenaline, stood over Mark, chest heaving slightly, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He finally had the reaction he wanted. He finally felt validated in his dominance. He had reduced the quiet, unassuming father to a victim. Lily let out a small, terrified gasp, burrowing her face into her father's arm. Mark, however, did not move. He did not cry out. He did not flinch, not truly. Slowly, deliberately, as if in slow motion, he brought his head back, turning his gaze, not to Derek, but to the coffee spill on Lily's drawing, then to his daughter's tear-streaked face. His quiet, almost serene expression had vanished, replaced by something ancient, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. The mild-mannered single dad was gone. In his place was a different man entirely, a man whose eyes now held the distant, unsettling calm of a storm front gathering. A silence, profound and heavy, settled over the room, thicker than any fog, as Mark slowly, deliberately, lowered his coffee cup. The softest clink against the saucer. A thunderclap in the sudden stillness. His eyes now fixed on Derek with a gaze that promised an awakening the bully would forever regret. The sharp, concussive crack had echoed through the morning chatter of the cafe, silencing it with the brutal efficiency of a sudden, unexpected gunshot. David's head snapped to the side, the force of the blow a white-hot spear of pain that lanced across his cheekbone, numbing the skin even as it set a furious throb pulsating deep within his jaw. A ringing in his ears drowned out the immediate aftermath, a high-pitched whine that warred with the stunned silence that had fallen over the previously bustling space. His vision swam for a split second, the vibrant colors of the cafe interior blurring into an indistinct wash before snapping back into brutal focus, every detail suddenly hyper-real, almost painfully sharp. He felt the metallic tang of blood welling in his mouth, a small split on the inside of his cheek, where his teeth had momentarily caught the impact. It was a familiar sensation, one that brought with it a cascade of long-suppressed memories, ghost-like whispers of grit and iron, and the acrid scent of cordite. But David pushed them down, a lifetime of training asserting itself in the milliseconds after the shock. His first instinct wasn't anger, not even indignation, but an immediate, almost clinical assessment of the threat. His eyes, though still stinging from the unexpected jolt, flickered, sweeping the periphery, gauging distances, exit routes, potential secondary aggressors. It was an involuntary response, honed over years, in environments where a single miscalculation meant the difference between life and a swift, brutal end. Lily, his daughter, a small, fragile weight clutching his leg, was the anchor that tethered him to the present, to this mundane cafe, to the fragile peace he had painstakingly built around them. He felt her tiny body stiffen, her grip tightening on his jeans, her breath catching in a small, horrified gasp. The sound, a mere whisper amidst the sudden vacuum of silence, was louder to him than the roar of a jet engine. It cut through the ringing, through the pain, through the nascent stirrings of something cold and dangerous deep within his own core. Protect. That was the command that overrode all others. The man who had delivered the blow, a mountain of belligerence, in an ill-fitting designer shirt, stood over him, chest puffed out, a sneer twisting his lips. Rex, David remembered from his internal quick scan, a name now etched in a different, more ominous part of his mental ledger. Rex's eyes, small and glittering with a cheap triumph, bored into David's, expecting capitulation, perhaps tears, definitely fear. What he found instead was a stillness that was utterly incongruous with the situation. David wasn't flinching. He wasn't recoiling. He was simply observing. And in that observation there was a depth, a chilling detachment that Rex, in his brutish arrogance, now was utterly incapable of discerning. The cafe, which only moments ago had hummed with the gentle clatter of ceramic, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the low murmur of conversations, was now a tableau of frozen terror. Baristas stood with trays half lifted, eyes wide with shock. Patrons, forks poised midair, stared, their faces a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a morbid fascination. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the very air had thickened, grown heavy with unspoken dread. A small child at a nearby table began to whimper, tugging at her mother's sleeve, instinctively sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "That's what you get, you piece of trash," Rex spat, his voice a low growl, thick with disdain and alcohol. He leaned in closer, his stale breath washing over David's face, plus a noxious cloud of cheap cologne and unresolved anger. "Thought you could ignore me, huh? Thought you were too good for people like us?" He punctuated his words with a jab of his finger towards David's chest, a gesture of dominance that in any other circumstance would have provoked an immediate, violent counter. But David remained impassive, a statue carved from granite, his internal world a tempest barely contained beneath a surface of glacial calm. His eyes, which had initially been assessing the room, narrowed slightly, now focusing solely on Rex. He wasn't seeing a man, he was seeing a kinetic threat vector. Height, weight, reach, stance, balance, tells. He cataloged them all with the practiced ease of a predator, sizing up its prey. Rex's stance was wide, aggressive, but amateurish. His weight was shifted too far forward, his balance easily compromised. His guard was down, his chin exposed, his movements telegraphing every intention. A cold, almost detached part of David's mind began to run simulations, calculating the myriad ways this encounter could end, each one faster, more brutal, and more efficient than the last. He could break Rex's nose with a flick of his wrist, dislocate his shoulder with a subtle shift of his body, or, if absolutely necessary, disable him completely with a precision strike to a pressure point that would leave him incapacitated for hours. The ease with which these options presented themselves was a testament to the life he had lived, the ghost of a warfighter that still resided within the quiet civilian. But Lily. Lily was still there, clinging to him, her small body trembling. Her whimpers were growing louder, evolving into small, choked sobs. Her fear was a living, breathing entity, a contagion that threatened to infect David's carefully constructed facade of normalcy. He couldn't unleash the beast here, not now, not in front of her. Not when she was watching, her innocent eyes reflecting the terror and confusion of the moment. He had promised her peace. He had promised her safety. And he had promised himself a new life, far from the shadows and the violence that had once defined him. "Leave him alone!" A voice, thin and reedy, suddenly pierced the tense silence. It was the cafe manager, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a perpetually worried expression, now etched with a desperate courage. He took a tentative step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of placation. "Sir, please, there's no need for this. We can resolve this peacefully." Rex turned his head, a predatory snarl replacing his sneer. "Stay out of this, old man," he barked, his voice rising, gaining volume, echoing in the now pin-drop silent cafe. "This ain't got nothing to do with you." He took a step towards the manager, his posture threatening, his bulk casting an intimidating shadow. The manager visibly flinched, his false bravado evaporating, replaced by a palpable fear that sent him scurrying back a step, then another, until he was almost pressed against the counter, his face ashen. This was the pattern David recognized with grim resignation. The bully asserts dominance, the weak retreat, and the cycle continues. Rex was reveling in it, drawing strength from the fear he instilled, his chest puffing out even further. He loved being the biggest, the loudest, the most intimidating presence in the room. He thrived on the submission of others. And in that moment, David saw not just Rex, but 1,000 faces from a different lifetime. Men who wielded power not for justice, but for control, for cruelty, for the sheer sadistic pleasure of it. He had faced them down in sun-baked deserts and forgotten alleys, in places where the rules of civilization didn't apply, where survival was the only currency. And he had always prevailed. But this was different. This was here. This was his new life. His quiet life, his daughter's life. He had spent years erasing the scars, both physical and emotional, years training himself to be unseen, unremarked upon, just another face in the crowd. The legendary operative, the phantom warrior who had once walked through fire and shadow, I had been meticulously dismantled, piece by painful piece, replaced by David, the single father who made school lunches and read bedtime stories. And now, this pathetic excuse for a human being threatened to unravel it all with a single brutal slap. The internal struggle was a maelstrom. Every fiber of his being screamed to react, to unleash the dormant power that lay coiled within him. His muscles twitched, a barely perceptible tremor beneath his skin. His breath, usually slow and controlled, hitched for a fraction of a second. The cold, analytical part of his brain warred with the primal urge to protect, to eliminate the threat. But the image of Lily, her small, tear-streaked face pressed against his leg, her fragile trust in his ability to keep her safe, was a powerful deterrent. He couldn't let her see that part of him. Not ever. He couldn't let the darkness he had so carefully buried resurface and taint her world. Rex, emboldened by the manager's retreat and David's continued silence, took another step, closing the distance between them. He raised his hand again, not to strike, but to grab. His large, meaty fingers reached out, intending to seize David by the collar, to physically drag him into a more humiliating posture. His eyes gleamed with malicious intent. "What's the matter, tough guy? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just a pathetic excuse for a man? Just like I thought." It was the dismissive tone, the utter contempt for David's existence, that began to chip away at the edges of his restraint. But it was the proximity, the invasive nature of the physical encroachment, the threat of being manhandled in front of Lily, that brought the beast to the very precipice of its cage. David's eyes, which had been passive, almost vacant, suddenly sharpened. A flicker of something cold, something ancient, something utterly ruthless passed through them. It was so fleeting, so subtle, that only someone trained to read the most minute tells, someone who had faced death in its myriad forms, would have even noticed it. It was the barest hint of the Delta Force legend stirring, a silent promise of unimaginable violence, waiting to be unleashed. His grip on Lily's shoulder, which had been comforting, now became impossibly firm, a silent message of reassurance, of unbreakable protection. He didn't move a muscle, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe visibly. But within the space of a single heartbeat, the air around him seemed to thicken, to hum with an almost palpable energy. He was no longer just a single dad in a cafe. He was a coiled spring, a dormant volcano, a weapon of precision and devastation, waiting for the exact moment, the precise provocation that would justify its activation. And Rex, in his blind, intoxicated arrogance, was about to provide it. The silence in the cafe stretched, taut, and agonizing, each second pregnant with the unspoken question, how much more could this man take before he snapped? And what precisely would happen when he did? The answer, known only to David and the ghosts of his past, hung heavy in the air, a chilling premonition of the storm about to break. The crimson imprint of the bully's hand burned on Alex's cheek, a stark, angry testament to the sudden, brutal act. It wasn't just a physical sting, it was an invisible, systemic shockwave that rippled through the small cafe, freezing every patron mid-sip, mid-conversation, mid-bite. A collective gasp, barely audible, hung in the air, a fragile sound swallowed by the cavernous silence that descended in the slap's immediate wake. The aroma of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries, moments before comforting, now seemed to curdle, replaced by an acrid tang of fear and unspoken outrage. Lily, nestled against Alex's side, had instinctively buried her face further into his hip, her tiny fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt with desperate, white-knuckled intensity. Her muffled whimper was the only sound that seemed to register in Alex's hyper-alert consciousness, a delicate counterpoint to the thunderous roar that threatened to erupt within him. Mark, the architect of this shattering silence, stood over Alex, his chest puffed out, a triumphant, almost gleeful malice twisting his features. His lips, thin and cruel, stretched into a sneer that promised more torment, more humiliation. He had expected a reaction, a flinch, an angry retort, perhaps even a clumsy lunge. What he got instead was a stillness so profound, so utterly devoid of typical human response, that it was unsettling even to his hardened sensibilities. Alex hadn't moved a muscle. His gaze, though direct, held no immediate fire, no outward sign of the inferno that surely must be raging beneath the surface. It was this unnerving calm, this almost preternatural composure in the face of such a blatant assault, that both baffled and further inflamed Mark's predatory instincts. He saw not suppressed rage but weakness, not discipline but pathetic submission. The café, which just moments ago had been a bustling tapestry of morning routines, a sanctuary of mundane comfort, was now a tableau of frozen horror. Cups were paused midair, spoons dangled precariously from lips, and conversations abruptly severed left words hanging like disembodied spirits. A young woman, midway through a cheerful story about her weekend, sat with her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with disbelief, a dollop of whipped cream still clinging to her upper lip. An elderly couple across the room, whose daily ritual involved sharing a single pastry and the morning news, had their hands clasped over their mouths, their faces etched with a mix of shock and nascent indignation. The barista, her hand hovering over the espresso machine, had gone utterly rigid, the rhythmic hiss of the steam wand dying down to an almost imperceptible whisper. All eyes, without exception, were fixed on Alex, then Mark, then Alex again, searching for an explanation, for an eruption, for anything that would break the terrible spell. "What, cat got your tongue, huh, tough guy?" Mark's voice, now louder, more piercing, cut through the quiet, a grating, dissonant chord. He leaned closer, his breath hot and stale against Alex's face, carrying the faint scent of stale cigarettes and cheap coffee. Too much of a coward to even respond? This is what you get for being a deadbeat dad. Bringing your kid into a place like this when you can barely afford the gas to get here. He gestured dismissively at the partially eaten plate of pancakes, his disdain palpable. The words were a calculated strike, aiming not just at Alex's pride, but at the very core of his identity as a protector, as a father. This was Mark's chosen weapon. Not just physical force, but the insidious poison of shame and ridicule, wielded with practiced cruelty. Alex, however, remained a statue. His internal world, though, was a maelstrom of conflicting directives, a battlefield where instinct warred with unwavering discipline. The sting on his cheek was a minor detail, almost irrelevant. He had endured far worse, physical and psychological tortures that would break most men. What truly registered was the sudden, alarming rush of adrenaline, a familiar and potent cocktail of fight-or-flight chemicals flooding his system. But his reaction wasn't the blind, uncontrolled fury Mark expected. It was a precise, almost clinical assessment. His eyes, though seemingly unfocused, were processing every detail. Mark's height, weight distribution, reach, the slight tremor in his hand that suggested an underlying insecurity despite the bravado. He noted the exits, the potential improvised weapons, a heavy coffee mug, a sturdy chair, the angles of approach. His ears, finely tuned from years in hostile environments, picked up the subtle shifts in the crowd. The rustle of a jacket, a muffled cough, the quick, sharp intake of breath from someone reaching for their phone. He could feel Lily's small, vulnerable body pressed against his, her frantic heartbeat thrumming against his side. Lily. Her presence was the anchor, the immutable constant that prevented the legendary operative, the lethal instrument of war, from manifesting. He was no longer Sergeant Major Alexander Alex Thorne, Delta Force. He was just Alex, a single father trying to give his daughter a semblance of a normal life. The conflict was exquisite, a silent internal scream against the constraints of his current reality. Mark, emboldened by Alex's continued silence, took a step closer, invading Alex's personal space with aggressive entitlement. He misread Alex's stillness as fear, his disciplined control as utter capitulation. "What's the matter, huh? Can't even look me in the eye? I bet you're used to taking orders, taking crap. That's why you're here, scrounging, while real men are out there making something of themselves." He sneered again, then pushed Alex's shoulder, a relatively gentle shove, but one loaded with contempt. The movement caused Alex to sway slightly, barely perceptible, a controlled flex of his core muscles absorbing the impact. His chair scraped faintly against the polished concrete floor, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the pervasive silence. A young waitress, her face pale, finally found her voice. "Sir, please, you need to leave. We'll call the police." Her voice trembled, but she stood her ground, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Mark merely flicked a dismissive glance at her, his lips curling further. "Oh, the little worker bee wants to play hero, does she? Go back to your lattes, honey. This doesn't concern you." He waved a hand in her direction, an imperious gesture that silenced her, though her eyes remained wide, with a mixture of fear and defiance. Alex's focus, meanwhile, was entirely on Lily. He felt her flinch at Mark's raised voice, her small frame tensing against him. He subtly shifted his weight, ever so slightly, positioning his body as a shield. His breathing, though appearing even to an untrained eye, was a practiced rhythmic control, a technique honed in countless life-or-death situations to manage adrenaline and maintain clarity. He could feel the fine hairs on his neck prickling, the primal warning system. But he suppressed the immediate, overwhelming urge to react. To unleash even a fraction of his capabilities here, in front of Lily, in this public space, would be catastrophic. It would shatter her innocence, expose her to a side of him she could never comprehend, a side he had painstakingly buried for her sake. He saw the glint of Mark's heavy signet ring as he gestured wildly, heard the almost imperceptible click of a few cell phone cameras, felt the shifting air currents from the quick movements of a few patrons discreetly backing away. He was aware of everything, processing it all, his mind a supercomputer running threat assessments and contingency plans at lightning speed. Yet, outwardly, he remained impassive. The blood pounded in his ears, a tribal drumbeat, echoing the old instincts. Kill it. Neutralize the threat. Protect the asset. But the asset wasn't a strategic target. It was his little girl. Look at him, Mark continued, a cruel edge entering his voice. He can't even stand up for himself. What kind of father's that, huh? Teaching his kid to be a weakling, just like him. You probably couldn't even protect her from a gust of wind, let alone someone who actually means business. Mark's words pierced through Alex's disciplined facade, now striking a nerve that vibrated with dangerous intensity. The implication that he couldn't protect Lily, that he was a failure as a father, was a line Alex had meticulously drawn in the sand, a boundary no one, absolutely no one, was permitted to cross. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the kitchen as a busboy dropped a tray of cutlery, the metallic crash momentarily breaking the cafe's spellbound tension. Head swiveled, then immediately snapped back to the unfolding drama, the brief interruption only serving to heighten the anticipation. Mark himself flinched, his composure momentarily ruffled, before he refocused his venomous gaze on Alex. He misinterpreted Alex's fixed, almost vacant stare as a complete collapse. He saw an open target, a man so broken he couldn't even muster an argument. This misjudgment would prove to be monumental. Mark, emboldened further by what he perceived as Alex's utter submission, reached out again, this time aiming not for Alex's shoulder but for his chest, intending a more forceful push. You know what? I think you need another reminder of your place. As his hand shot forward, Alex's seemingly inert body executed a movement so subtle, so fluid and precise, it was almost invisible. He shifted his weight, not stepping back but rotating his torso fractionally, his left shoulder dropping just enough to create a void where Mark's hand was intended to land. The bully's open palm brushed against Alex's jacket, finding no purchase, no resistance, no impact. Mark, off balance from his own momentum and the unexpected lack of counterforce, stumbled forward a half step, his arm flailing uselessly in the air for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a block, not a shove, not even a parry in the traditional sense. It was pure, unadulterated evasion, performed with a speed and efficiency that spoke not of instinct, but of countless hours of rigorous training. Mark regained his footing quickly, a scowl deepening on his face. But a flicker of confusion, a momentary bewilderment, crossed his features. He couldn't quite articulate what had just happened. It was as if Alex had simply evaporated from the path of his hand, only to reappear seamlessly in the exact same spot. His expression unchanged, his eyes still fixed in that unsettling, unblinking gaze. To the casual observer, it might have looked like Mark simply missed, a clumsy movement on his part. But to anyone with a discerning eye, a keen understanding of kinetics, it was a display of an entirely different order of control. "What was that, you freak?" Mark spat, his voice laced with a fresh surge of frustrated anger. He felt a subtle shift in the air around Alex, a barely perceptible tightening, an almost imperceptible hum of contained energy. It was a sensation his primitive mind couldn't quite grasp, but it unnerved him nonetheless. He had expected a cowering dog, but found instead a stone wall that simply wasn't where it was supposed to be. Enraged by this unexpected, almost supernatural resistance, by the growing unease in the pit of his stomach, Mark decided to escalate. He lunged, not with a precise strike, but with a full body shove, aiming to send Alex sprawling, to shatter his unnerving composure once and for all. He wanted to see Alex helpless, to hear him cry out. His hands went for Alex's shoulders, intending to use his full weight. Alex, still holding Lily close with one arm, braced himself. This time he absorbed the impact. He slid backward, the legs of his chair scraping loudly, screeching against the floor as it was forced into the wall behind him. A heavy decorative plant, precariously perched on a nearby ledge, wobbled dangerously. Cups rattled on tables and a few patrons gasped again, louder this time. Mark stood over Alex, triumphant for a second, his chest heaving, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He raised his hand again, his palm open, clearly intending another violent slap, perhaps even a punch. And this time, his eyes flickered down momentarily towards Lily, who was now whimpering audibly, baring her face completely. That fleeting glance, that unspoken threat to his child, was the spark. It was the moment the legend, so carefully suppressed, began to stir. In an instant, Alex's eyes, which had been so unnervingly placid, snapped into focus. The placid surface shattered, revealing the abyssal depths beneath. A dark, primal intensity flared to life within them. A cold, calculating fury that radiated outwards, palpable and suffocating. His jaw, which had been merely set, now clenched, the muscles working visibly beneath his skin. His breath, though still controlled, took on a deeper, more resonant quality. He didn't move, not a single muscle twitched, but the very air around him seemed to change, becoming heavy, charged, pregnant, with a terrifying unspoken power. It was no longer the air of a cozy cafe. It was the atmosphere of a jungle, a battlefield, a place where life and death hung in the balance. Mark's hand, hovering inches from Alex's face, faltered. His sneer wavered, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending fear. He saw something in Alex's gaze that transcended mere anger, something ancient and utterly terrifying. It was the look of a predator, not of a man, but of an archetype, a creature stripped of all pretense, poised on the knife edge of unleashing unimaginable violence. He saw not a single dad, not a weakling, but a void, a bottomless pit of lethal capability. The cafe fell utterly silent again, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound, all light. Every single person present held their breath, their eyes glued to the two men, waiting for the inevitable, for the terrifying storm that now felt utterly, irrevocably imminent. The bully's hand hung suspended, frozen in the heavy, charged air, the terror in his eyes growing with each passing, agonizing second. The sharp, stinging impact of Marco's palm across Alex's cheek was not just a physical assault, it was a detonation, a catastrophic rupture in the carefully constructed facade of a peaceful life. A ringing silence descended upon the bustling cafe, a sudden vacuum where the clatter of ceramic and the murmur of conversation had been. Every eye, every breath was now fixated on the tableau before them. Alex, head turned slightly from the blow, a vivid red mark blooming on his skin, and Marco, hands still poised in the air, a sneer of victorious malice contorting his features. Lily, frozen in terror, clutched her teddy bear tighter, her small face mirroring the shock of the entire room. For Alex, the world narrowed to a pinprick of crimson fury. The metallic tang of blood in his mouth was secondary to the primal roar that threatened to escape his throat. Years of disciplined suppression, of compartmentalizing a life lived on the precipice of controlled violence, battled against the immediate instinctual urge to dismantle the man before him. He had chosen this path, this quiet existence for Lily. For her, he endured the stares, the whispers, even the petty slights. But this was different. This was a violation not just of his person, but of the sanctity of their small, protected world. He felt the cold, familiar tendrils of something ancient and terrible stirring within him, a shadow stretching, growing. Marco, misinterpreting Alex's momentary stillness as submission, fueled by a corrosive cocktail of ego and cheap bravado, leaned in. His voice, a low, menacing growl, cut through the tension. "What's the matter, hero? Lost your tongue? Or maybe just your spine?" He chuckled, a guttural sound that grated on the nerves. And then, with a horrifying, deliberate movement, his hand shot out, not to strike Alex again, but to seize Lily's arm. "How about we teach the little princess a lesson about respecting her elders, eh?" It was as if a switch had been flipped, not just in Alex, but in the very fabric of reality. The cafe, a place of warmth and innocent comfort moments ago, now felt like a cage, charged with raw, untamed energy. The world blurred for a fraction of a second, colors and sounds merging into a primal scream. The meticulous dam Alex had built around his past, brick by painful brick, shattered. The gentle father, the quiet widower, then the man trying desperately to blend into the mundane, vanished. In his place stood something else entirely. His eyes, which moments before had held a sorrowful depth, hardened into chips of glacial ice, reflecting nothing but absolute, lethal intent. His jaw, still marked by Marco's blow, tightened, a muscle ticking involuntarily. The subtle shift in his posture was almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. But it was there, a sudden, coiled tension, a readiness that spoke of thousands of hours of specialized training, of reflexes honed in unforgiving environments. His shoulders, usually slightly slouched in a gesture of understated humility, squared, expanding under his simple t-shirt with an unnerving solidity. Every line of his body seemed to reconfigure itself, abandoning the relaxed casualness of a civilian for the predatory economy of a weapon. A gasp rippled through the cafe, a collective exhalation of breath as several patrons, seemingly at once, recognized the dangerous metamorphosis. One man, a grizzled veteran with a faded tattoo on his forearm, stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. His face, etched with a mixture of terror and dawning realization, paled. "My God," he whispered, the words barely audible. That's Alex Shadow Thorne." The name, a whispered ghost from a forgotten past, hung in the electrified air. Marco, oblivious, his hand still gripping Lily's arm, pulling her slightly forward, felt a sudden, inexplicable tremor of unease. The man before him was no longer the meek, unresponsive target he had taunted. There was a shift in the air pressure, a cold, silent warning that permeated his very bones. His sneer wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. That flicker was all Alex needed. Time seemed to distend, each microsecond stretching into an eternity. His left hand, moving with a speed that defied human perception, shot out. It wasn't a punch, not a grab, but a precision strike that intersected Marco's wrist mid-movement, just above Lily's small hand. The impact wasn't forceful enough to break bone, but it was perfectly timed, perfectly angled, leveraging the full force of Marco's own momentum against him. A sharp, sickening crack echoed in the stunned silence, as Marco's grip on Lily instantly disintegrated, his arm twisting at an unnatural angle. A choked cry of pain tore from Marco's throat, a sound quickly stifled. Before Marco could fully process the shock and agony, Alex's right hand moved. It was a blur of controlled power, not a closed fist, but an open palm. However, this wasn't a slap. This was a concussive force, delivered with surgical precision to a specific pressure point beneath Marco's jaw. The strike was upward and inward, designed not to inflict superficial damage, but to overwhelm the neurological system, to disrupt balance and consciousness. There was a dull thud, a sound utterly devoid of the messy violence of a street brawl, yet far more terrifying in its chilling efficiency. Marco's eyes rolled back into his head, his body stiffening momentarily, then going completely limp. He crumpled to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut, a lifeless heap of designer clothes and bruised ego. The entire sequence, from Alex's transformation to Marco's collapse, as it had taken less than 2 seconds, It was a ballet of brutal economic violence, executed with the detached professionalism of someone who had done it countless times before, in far more desperate circumstances. The cafe erupted, not in screams, but in a collective, horrified gasp. The man who had uttered Alex's name stumbled again, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and reverence. "That's Shadow," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "The whisper, the legend. He was Delta Force, top tier. They called him Ghost in the sand. You never saw him coming, never knew he was there until it was too late." The words, though quiet, resonated with the weight of untold stories, of conflicts unseen, of skills honed beyond civilian comprehension. The revelation spread like wildfire, a sudden, horrifying understanding, washing over the stunned patrons. The bully had not just picked a fight with a single dad. He had awakened a sleeping Leviathan. Lily, no longer gripped by Marco's hand, stared up at her father. Her initial fear quickly dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of awe and an unshakable belief that her dad was, indeed, the strongest person in the world. She didn't fully comprehend the technical precision of his actions, only the absolute, undeniable protection radiating from him. She saw the rage, yes, but beneath it, she felt the unwavering love that had fueled his restraint and then his swift, decisive action. She released her teddy bear and, with trembling fingers, reached out to touch the red mark on his cheek. Her small gesture was enough to bring Alex back from the brink, pulling him out of the cold, tactical mind space, and grounding him once more in the warmth of the cafe, in the reality of his daughter's innocent touch. He knelt, bringing himself to her level, his eyes softening, though the steely glint never fully faded. "Are you okay, sweet pea?" he asked, his voice low, a tremor of residual adrenaline beneath his gentle cadence. Lily nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with delayed reaction. Alex held her tight, one hand stroking her hair, the other resting protectively on her back, his gaze sweeping the room. The cafe manager, a portly man named Arthur, stood by the counter, utterly dumbfounded. He had witnessed the entire spectacle, from Marco's aggression to Alex's chilling response. He had seen the terror in Marco's eyes just before he went down, a terror that resonated with every fiber of Arthur's being. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed emergency services. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet afternoon. 2 patrol cars arrived, followed shortly by an ambulance. The scene inside the cafe was orderly, almost eerily so. Marco remained prone, unconscious, his face pale, a small trickle of blood appearing from his nose. Alex stood calmly, holding Lily, who clung to him like a limpet. The police officers, accustomed to chaos, were met with an unusual silence and a room full of shell-shocked witnesses. As the officers began to take statements, the story unfolded piece by piece, corroborated by multiple, eager voices. The aggression, the slap, the threat to the child, and then the inexplicable, terrifying efficiency of the father's response. When the name Alex Thorne and the whispers of Delta Force began to circulate, the officers exchanged glances, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. They knew the type, quiet, unassuming, but with a past that commanded respect and a healthy dose of apprehension. Alex, when it was his turn, spoke with a quiet authority, his voice steady. He described Marco's actions, his own attempts to de-escalate, and the final, intolerable threat to Lily. He omitted no detail but offered no embellishment. "He grabbed my daughter," Alex stated, his gaze meeting the officer's directly. "I defended her." His words were simple, factual, and imbued with an undeniable truth that resonated with every parent in the room. Marco was eventually revived by the paramedics, being groggy and disoriented. The moment his eyes fluttered open, he saw Alex standing across the room, Lily still in his arms, observing him with an unnerving calm. A wave of visceral terror washed over Marco. He remembered the cold precision, the absolute lack of hesitation, and the whispered name. He suddenly understood the true, terrifying nature of the man he had dared to provoke. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a trembling fear. He would make no accusations, offer no resistance. He merely closed his eyes, his face etched with a profound, humiliating defeat. He knew with absolute certainty that his life as he knew it was over. The physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of that realization. In the ensuing days, the story of the cafe confrontation spread like wildfire, not just through the local community, but across social media and even local news outlets. The "Bully slapped a single dad" headline quickly transformed into "Cafe Bully takes on Delta Force legend." The anonymity Alex had so carefully cultivated was irrevocably shattered. People sought him out, some with awe, others with gratitude, many simply with curiosity. The man who had once been just a quiet father picking up his daughter was now a figure of almost mythic proportion. For Marco, the consequences were swift and severe. Beyond the criminal charges for assault and battery, the viral videos of his ignominious defeat, coupled with the revelation of Alex's past, destroyed his reputation. His business, built on flimsy connections and intimidation, crumbled. Clients abandoned him, associates distanced themselves, and the respect he had once commanded through fear turned into universal scorn. He became a pariah, a living testament to the dangers of underestimating the quiet ones. The humiliation, the public shaming, would follow him far longer than any jail sentence. For Alex, life changed, but not entirely for the worse. The initial discomfort of renewed attention eventually settled into a new equilibrium. People in the cafe now greeted him with a deference born of respect, not fear. Other parents approached him, not to gossip, but to express solidarity and admiration. He was still the quiet, devoted father, but now he was also something more, a silent protector, a living reminder that some strengths run deeper than appearances. Lily, initially shaken, found a renewed sense of security in her father's presence. She understood, though in her innocent way, that her dad had done what he had to do to keep her safe. The incident, rather than scarring her, solidified her trust and admiration for him. She saw his love, pure and fierce, shining through the brief moment of controlled fury. Their bond, already strong, deepened, fortified by the shared experience. Life in the small cafe town continued. Alex and Lily still went for their weekly coffee and pastry, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted. There was a quiet understanding in the air, a silent respect for the man who carried the weight of a legendary past with the gentle hand of a loving father. He had reminded everyone that true strength wasn't about aggression, but about what you were willing to defend. It was about standing up, not just for yourself, but for those you loved. So, even if it meant revealing the ghost of a legend. And in doing so, he had paradoxically found a new kind of peace, one forged in the crucible of his past and protected by the unwavering love for his daughter. What do you think of Alex's decision to finally unleash his skills? Was his swift, decisive action justified, given the escalating threat to his daughter? Share your thoughts on how this confrontation reshaped their lives and the perception of the quiet father.